Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining Lee Feldman and myself today for another episode, another webinar session in our series of talks with city managers around the state. And we're going to talk today about what city leadership and city management would look like coming into May. Lee, thank you so much for joining us today. And
Sure.
I will give Lee in a second a chance to introduce himself and his experience. Just to go briefly over the agenda, first of all, let Lee again share more about himself and also about the city of Gainesville. Then we'll talk about challenges due to COVID-19 circumstances, both in the city and with the residents of the city. We'll also talk about the fact that Gainesville is a university city and how it impacted college towns in particular. And then we'll go into specific strategies and best practices, whether it's about budget, reopening, and go and share more questions and answers and answer to any questions. But please feel free to click on the Q&A button and share any question throughout. We'll stop and answer questions also throughout the webinar, but we'd leave a couple of minutes at the end. Lee, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Noah. So, hi. I've looked at the participant list and recognized quite a few names, so I won't go into a very detailed introduction of myself, but if you go to www.leefeldman.com, you will find a musician by that name, so that's not me. That's a very good jazz pianist out of New York City. But for those of you who know me, I've been in this business now for about 35 years. I've been city manager in 4 cities in Florida, starting with North Miami, Palm Bay, Fort Lauderdale, and now, as of November of 2019, Gainesville. So I'm a rather new entity here in the city of Gainesville, and I'm still learning about the city. So learning about the city in your first 6 months while you're in the middle of a pandemic is a pretty interesting experience, because you're not only learning about the community, but you're also learning about the organization while the organization is in a different mode than the everyday time. Gainesville itself is a unique city. We're a university college town, home of the University of Florida, where Gatorade was developed back in the 60s. Gainesville is a city of about 133,000 people, of which about 45 to 50,000, depending on who you ask, are students. Those students left in March, and some stayed back, but classes basically went all online in the middle of March, and will remain online at least through the summer semester. So we are operating in a very different environment in terms of our student to resident population. We are politically also a city, largest city in Alachua County. County itself is about 260,000 people. I think it would be fair to characterize us politically as being a very progressive blue city in the middle of a sea of red. So very conservative outside of our geographic boundaries of the city, and that puts a different spin on how we're dealing with the pandemic as well. So that's a little bit about me and the city of Gainesville.
Lee, just what you last said was pretty interesting. If you can maybe share a few sentences of because we're going to go into COVID-19 just in a brief moment, but how do you see the city kind of dealing differently maybe than the county? Because you did share there is some differences between the city and the county reaction in terms of COVID-19.
Yeah, so not necessarily between the governments, but among the populations. So We are a very liberal, progressive community, mostly because we're driven by the faculty and the students in the school, and colleges tend to be more that liberal focus. And then as you get outside the city, you get more into the conservative mainstream. And so what we're seeing at the national level, the strife between the parties, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, is all playing out here in the county as well. And as we're starting to see that manifest itself in terms of what the response should be for the pandemic, I think we become a sort of a sub unit of that whole discussion at the national level.
And I think what's interesting and what I'm always hearing in all the city manager conferences I'm going to is that the fact that at the end, the cities are not, you need to manage the day-to-day life of the resident. It doesn't matter which party they relate to.
Yeah, the last time I checked, the pothole did not have a party affiliation.
Exactly. So just, you touched it just a bit, but if you can share just a bit more about what are the different top challenges that you're experiencing today when you come to work in regards of COVID-19 response.
Well, I think the community has a lot of uncertainty, maybe some degree of fear, and that's on several different levels. So, and I think this is playing out not only here, but around the country. So first of all, you have the virus. People still don't know what it is. People don't know how it's contracted, how it's ultimately treated, whether they have been exposed or not, whether they are asymptomatic or not. Testing is still, sparse in terms of who gets tested, and the results still take some time. And so there's concern over your personal health, and I think that's playing out. And that ebbs and flows based upon what we hear in the news. Then there's the fear of just basic survival from an economic standpoint. A large number of employers had to close. So people who had jobs no longer have jobs. I mean, we've seen, the jobs numbers in the US came out again. We're hitting the same levels, if not higher, of unemployment as we had in the Great Depression back in the 1920s and 30s. And so, that's a big fear, and so people don't know where their next check is coming from. Here in the state of Florida, the unemployment application system is broken, so people cannot even readily apply for unemployment benefits. So they literally don't know where their next checks are going to come from. And then we've also got the issue about the divide in our communities between the haves and the have-nots, the economically advantaged versus the economically disadvantaged. News and the ability to survive is different. How we reach out, which communities are more at risk for exposure to COVID. How do we reach out to those communities? How do we get the right people tested at the right time? And having to do that in a system that is structured between the city, the county, and the state, with all these subunits that are out there, just makes it more trying and difficult.
Do you find that residents are confused about which authority has, what type of authority? For example, for unemployment, is it something that the city is experiencing?
So I'm confused as to who has what authority. So if I'm confused, I would imagine our neighbors in Gainesville are equally as confused. So for example, in Florida, and this is unique to Florida, we have county health departments, which have taken the lead in terms of testing and coordination of the public health response. But county health departments don't work for the county. They work for the state. They're just called county health departments. So that creates, confusion. Coordination between different levels of government. The school systems. In Florida, we have 67 independent school systems, each with the same geographic boundaries of the county. And the governor, however, and the Department of Education at the state is making the calls as to whether schools are open or closed throughout the state. So that doesn't even become a local or a county decision. So you have, which entities have jurisdiction, and then which entities have the control, and the two may not actually line up at any given day.
Which sounds pretty confusing for any resident, as you mentioned. Even for city managers, it's not necessarily that clear. You did mention the specific challenge of university towns. So if we go back to what you said, you have 133,000 residents in the city of Gainesville. What percentage of them are part of the university, are students?
So I don't know that I did the math, but it's close to about 25% of our population on any given day. Normally would be students between the University of Florida and Santa Fe College.
And many of them left in the last couple of weeks.
Well, so they left and they didn't leave. We really don't know the number. We do know that the university closed down their housing, except for the students that couldn't leave. So there's international students that couldn't leave. There are some students that literally don't have a home to go back to. And there are some students that just don't want to go back home to live with mom and dad. I mean, they've had their independence. They like their independence, and they'll ride it out in their dorm room. And then we have a lot of off-campus housing. So there we had students that basically, again, decided that they would either go home or stay. A lot of them stayed because they were in leases and had obligations to make rent payments. So if they had to pay rent, then they were going to stay. Some stayed because they had part-time jobs and they didn't want to give up their part-time job if the business establishment was still open. So they try to balance that as well.
And how do you?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you today how many students actually left and how many didn't. But you can tell the town is more in our spring break and summer mode than anything else.
And what do you think are the unique challenges in face of COVID-19 that university towns are experiencing as opposed to towns without universities?
So the biggest one probably is we don't call students any longer. We call them vectors. So in our particular timing, when COVID broke out on there, University of Florida students were on spring break. They were all over the country, right? Some actually left internationally. And then they came back from spring break, traveling on planes, having been to places that were COVID hotspots, and they all came back to Gainesville on there. And so some of them may have had COVID-19. Some of them may have just been carrying it and transmitters, and that then led to the potentials for community spread. Then they all went back home, or some of them went back home, but the idea was that students were all supposed to go back home. Then taking whatever mix they had here in Gainesville and then bringing it to other places as well. Then what we're going to experience is that students are going to come back sometime in the summer, early fall, and they too are going to be returning from places that may still be COVID hotspots back into the university community. Now, with the local economy,
so just to reiterate the last point, so what you're saying is that there is a lot more movement in university towns, both in the city and out of the city, and then in again basically mixing a lot of different populations and states and, you know, and anything related.
Yes, I mean, it's, you know, University of Florida has students from all 50 states. I think, you know, close to 60 international countries that are representative. Some that have been heavily hit by COVID. I know that there was one group of university students that was in Italy when this broke, and they had to come back. Well, they came back to campus, coming from, you know, one of the major hotspots in the world, and so you have a lot of influx, and then you have a lot of outflux. And so what's you know, what's going to happen ultimately then is when students come back, there needs to be a good testing and tracing, contact tracing program put in place, so that if somebody does come back and has been exposed, that there can be good, sufficient contact tracing, you know, to help identify who else may have been exposed. So the university is going to have to operate differently when it returns.
And we do actually have a couple of questions from the crowd, if you don't mind. First one is, how is the city manager, Mr. Feldman, needed to be kind of visible in the organization and community with the health risks associated with circulating in public? And in other words, so, you know, how visible do you need to be during this pandemic, and how different it is from regular peaceful days?
So I always prefer my mayor and commission to be the most visible. And so one of the things we've done here for our community is we've hosted telephone town hall meetings weekly with the mayor chairing those and then bringing in experts. And for those who are not familiar with the concept of telephone town halls, that's where you dial out to every phone number that you have in a list, sort of like how campaigns do that, and then carry on a 1-hour conversation with the community that way. So we've been putting the mayor out as the most visible person and the face of the city's response. We're also very heavily engaged in social media by pushing out messaging. You'll see a slide in a minute about one of our methods of doing that through Captain Quarantine. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Within the organization itself, you know, it's tough to be as visible as you want to be, you know, especially with everybody that is either working remotely or, you know, is out in the field doing the jobs that they have. I've been, you know, trying to make an effort when I see a crew on the road or, you know, popping into a fire station here or there, or if I see a police car parked with the officer working on a report, approaching in a socially distant and safe manner with the face covering, but letting you know that, you know, we appreciate the work that they're doing. And also, you know, to the extent that we can, you know, trying to reiterate that for our workforce, our community builders itself. But it's not easy because you don't have that type of, you know, ability to walk the halls or talk to people, you know, directly. So it's operating differently. And candidly, I have not been doing, you know, the best job at being visible among the workforce as I'd like to. But just trying to figure out how we do it better. We did host a telephone town hall meeting for all of our community builders in the city last Monday, where the calls went out to just them instead of the public. And unfortunately, I had to be at a city commission meeting, virtual city commission meeting, so I couldn't even participate in that. But, you know, I think we've got to figure out how to be creative in that way.
Yeah, and it seems that the city of Gainesville has been created. So maybe you can explain to the crowd kind of what we're seeing here.
So Captain Quarantine is the creation of a member of our comms communications staff who has the ability to do some animation and pitch it to our communication engagement director. And she took it and ran with it. And so Captain Quarantine has sort of become our mascot around town. We have posters up and signs that we've put into the medians and flags up, all with basically the message from the captain of, stay home, stay at home, wash your hands, be safe out there. And so our comm staff even had the animation skills. And so I think we've produced 2 episodes of Captain Quarantine and his social distancing practices. So it's sort of taken on.
And what's the reaction by the public to this type of very creative way of sharing the message?
So I think we've gotten generally very good feedback on there. There have been some few exceptions on there. That's one of the few exceptions. So there's a wall in Gainesville that's on the edge of the campus, which you can basically take over little segments of and paint it. And so a member of our staff had painted Captain Quarantine on there, and with the message of being a superhero and stay home. Well, again, as I mentioned, there are there's a segment of the area population outside of the city that is believes that cities and counties and states should not have stay-at-home orders, and that there's really no danger, and that the whole COVID-19 is a false response. And so you can see the result of one person's opinion. Now, we did put this up on one of our Facebook posts and suggested that this is the wrong approach to freedom of expression, though people have a right to do that. However, we were all set to repaint it, and somebody took it on their own to repaint it and put it back to its normal condition. So I was happy to see that. But this one Facebook post from our communications director went viral, and we got a lot of national response that we were trampling on people's rights by telling them to stay home and keeping businesses, non-essential businesses, closed. So not everybody's been on board with social distancing and the idea of flattening the curve.
And another question that we're getting here is that, do you feel, or how do you measure kind of the split, if there is one, in the community regarding the stay-at-home instructions and measures?
Well, I mean, one of the products we use is your product on there to measure what's happening out in social media. So we're looking at that and trying to get feedback and see what the sentiment analysis is. But ultimately, we believe we know what the right thing to do is, and we're going to do it despite there being a group of naysayers. We know that the way to hit community spread is to physically distance yourself, not necessarily socially distance yourself. I think the terminology there is a little off, but you have to maintain a physical distance and put into place protection, washing the hands, face coverings when you're out in public, not standing on top of people, not doing stuff that is going to cause a possible transmission, both for your own safety and for the safety of the neighbor next to you.
This is actually a pretty interesting way of thinking about it, that maybe social distancing to essence sound so negative, where you can stay, you can be physically distant but maybe socially connected, and we need to find new ways to communicate without feeling alienated and social, because social distancing has such a strong and negative connotation.
Right. I think people are starting to live in a new virtual environment. There's the Florida City County Management Association I know there's some individuals that are doing Zoom, virtual Zoom cocktail hours on Friday afternoons at 5:30. So if people want to join that, they can certainly send me a note and I'll put them in contact with the person who's organizing that. We talked about being visible. I found out that there was an HOA meeting, homeowners association meeting in the city, and I Zoom bombed it. I got in and showed up and said, "Hey, I'm here. I just wanted to touch base for a few minutes and tell you what's going on." And so, there's different virtual ways of doing that. But just walking your neighborhood, having the ice cream truck come by and making sure everybody is out there, but physically distant is a way of still building community, literally one block at a time. And we're trying to do things, sing-alongs. We're working on a video right now using local talent. A couple of our local famous artists and using their songs to help bring the community together. We've taken some of our staff that really didn't have a function in this role and repurposed some of the things that they have been doing, so that now they're calling our elderly shut-ins once a day just to check on them and talk about the families and what's going on, and sort of becoming a pen pal, a virtual pen pal with them.
And these are city employees that worked on other departments that you repurposed in order to reach the community?
Correct. So for example, if we had a community center that we had to shut down, but I had community center staff, the question is, what are they, what's their role? And so we repurposed that role so they could do that. We trained some of our staff up, or we're getting ready to, until the health department told us they didn't need us any longer, but we were going to help them with contact tracing if they needed that. So we were looking, since we've taken the position here in the city that nobody's being furloughed, nobody is getting reduction in hours on there. We don't want to just pay our community builders to sit home. We want them to help us respond in any way that they can. And so we've been looking at different ways that they can still stay engaged in the workforce while still being actively employed with us.
And this is actually connected to the next question we got from the crowd, is how do you communicate with the segments of your community that do not use social media or other traditional media platforms?
So that's been a little bit difficult. I mean, ads in newspapers that we know that those sections of the community read. Public service announcements on the radio stations that are popular in that section of the community. But one of the things we had to do, and this just shows you how adept we are at sort of thinking on the fly. We knew that there's a certain section of our population, mostly African American and low to moderate, that's highly at risk for COVID, but we're just not getting the information about how to get tested on there. And so with the Department of Health, we devised a door hanger, and we delivered roughly 25,000 door hangers in one day to every household that was in a low to moderate income census district of our city. Basically, if they were in a CDBG eligible block, census block, they got a flyer delivered to their door, hung on their door. And so so that's the type of approach you have to do sometimes to get the messaging out there.
Yeah, it's a lot of creativity is needed. So can you maybe share, we touched just briefly about the economy when we talked about the fact that a lot of the population is younger students, but can you maybe share a bit about what is the city doing to support the businesses right now?
Sure. So, with the students leaving and with some of the non-essential businesses having to close, we wanted to try to do every little bit we could to help those. So you have up on the slide, Feed GNB. So we know that a lot of the homeless shelters, we have two primary homeless shelters within the city, needed to feed the vulnerable population, whether they were shelter inhabitants or not, on there. And so what we decided to do was to basically buy meals from local restaurants, have those meals prepared as grab and go, and have them either picked up or delivered to our Grace Marketplace shelter, where they could then be handed out to the vulnerable populations. And so basically sandwiches were prepared for lunch and dinner, bought by the city and delivered out to the shelter for distribution. And we're doing that 2 meals a day, 7 days a week. We may branch to breakfast in the future, but that's a way of taking some of the resources that we have and being able to put those dollars back into the community.
Yeah, investing in the local businesses.
The other program on the slide is a little bit more ambitious, and we're in the process of rolling that out. It's a $3.2 million program we call GNB Cares, which provides roughly $1.6 million worth of grants for rent and utility payments to our most vulnerable, extremely low, very low and moderate income households, which would assist them for a 2-month period in meeting those rent and utility payments. And then another $1.6 million that would be given out in $5,000 grants to our small businesses under 50 people, under 50 employees that were also hurt by the COVID-19 response in terms of having them lose revenue because they had to either halt or curtail their operations. So both of those programs are being unveiled now. Applications will be going up on a site, and you can get more information by going to gnbcares.org, gnbcares.org. That site went live last night, and hopefully our applications will go out starting Friday or Saturday in the coming days. We'll take an application period, and then our plan is to have checks go out on May 17th. So it's a pretty ambitious timetable for us.
It is ambitious, but I believe that the community is probably very excited about all these initiatives. And is it something that you're also sharing? You said that you have a dedicated website. Is it something that you're also sharing on media and social media and other channels that you think that residents are tuned in?
Oh, absolutely. So it's on all of our social media outlets. We're again taking ads out in the newspapers, both the primary and the secondary newspaper media, and just try and get the word out any way that we can. I think I said May 17th. Our goal is actually May 11th.
So you just lost 6 more days in the last minute.
I didn't want to shortchange our folks or give any of my great community builders that are listening any hope that they have more time than they do. So.
And you had some news in Florida just in the last few days regarding reopening, right?
Yeah. So this poses another problems for cities, and I know there's a few cities that are listening to the call today too. We're responding today to the governor's order released late last night, and we're finding out information pretty much at the same time the general public is finding out information, and then we have to turn around and be able to respond. So yesterday at 5 p.m. the governor announced that we are in all but 3 counties in the state of Florida, so 64 out of 67 counties will be reopening restaurants with limited occupancy and retail spaces with limited occupancy, and a few other reopening aspects. So we learned that from Governor DeSantis during his press conference, and pretty much today I've been trying to figure out what that means for Gainesville and our surrounding neighboring communities in the county.
And I think this is something that we're feeling worldwide, that a lot of the city leaders are saying that they're getting the news with the residents, which means that you have very, very short time to respond. So what are the first, when you heard that last night, what are the first things that you need to start thinking about in order to align with the reopening of the economy motion?
Well, I mean, the first response was, say to yourself, really? That's what we're doing? But then we're doing it. So here in Gainesville in the Alachua County, I think all the cities in the county have agreed that we need to approach this unified, that one city cannot have different standards for reopening than other cities. And so we're trying to work through today what that means based upon the governor's order.
And this is also something I want to ask. So do you feel now, because really, all the cities are experiencing very similar things or in a different pace. Is it something that brings the different leaders together in terms of alignment or best practices or learning from what different cities are doing?
Well, I think we're all learning from what everybody else is doing. I know I spend at least an hour or two a day just reading through blogs and newsletters, learning what other local government professionals are doing around the state and the country. And I'm not ashamed to say, I'm the first one to plagiarize it and jump on it and try to put the Gainesville spin on it too, because if it's good practice somewhere else, it may be a very good practice here. And Gainesville certainly doesn't have all the answers. We don't even want to begin to think that we have all the answers. But what we want to do is we want to see what our fellow cities from around the country and around the world are doing that we can, pick up and mimic. And so I'm constantly scanning, newsletters and blogs and trying to find the best of the best. And I'm trying to engage in conversations with others around the state and around the country that I know, to pick their brains on things as well.
And we talked briefly about different impacts on the city hall. One of them has been the repurposing of particular functions in the city. Can you maybe comment about additional changes or additional things that you need to take, basically, to make the proper adjustments?
So I mean, the biggest adjustment is living in this virtual world. I mean, it's, I've done some meetings, Zoom or GoToMeetings or Cisco WebEx in the past. But now I sort of like live looking at a computer screen, and that's tough because it's hard to engage people, on there, and it's hard for teams to work together when you're in this virtual environment. And even though the product is called like Microsoft Teams, it's not. And so I guess collaboration has been sort of stymied or has digressed a little, because collaboration is not necessarily in real time any longer. It's more of, people are trying to do different things, and there's an expectation that you're always available now. And it's different, right? And so that's taking some getting used to for me, and I'm sure it's taking some getting used to for our workforce as well. And I commend them all for trying to think, how do they perform their jobs differently? And then ultimately we're going to have to return back to work. And so how do we return back to City Hall, and what does that look like? How do we, how will the now normal look? Will everything be face guards and face shields and gloves? At what point will that be relaxed? How do we protect against a second wave? I mean, all those are issues that need to be confronted with, and I think we're all trying to think what that looks like.
Another question that we just got is, how is your city planning to phase employees returning to work? How is your city planning to reopen city facilities like the city hall, library, and parks? So I think you just started commenting about it. Is it something that you're already making the plans, expecting it will happen in the next few weeks?
So as far as City Hall and returning to letting the public back into City Hall, I don't think we're going to do that until we hit phase 2.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody asked me, well, when are we going to hit phase 2? And my only reply back to them was sometime after phase 1 and before phase 3. Do you have any criteria for, phase 2? So phase 2 has been set out by both the White House in terms of gating criteria, as well as the state, which has pretty much adopted the federal gating criteria. So the state is pretty much going to determine when we hit phase 2 on there, but we're going to need to be, ready and in place to do that. So right now we're trying to get all the tools and equipment necessary to make sure when we hit there, we're there. I mean, we've bought aeroclaves for decontamination of public spaces. We're buying every piece of plexiglass we can get our hands on. We're making sure that we have enough PPE for our entire workforce. Not all of it's going to be N95 masks, but cloth face coverings for all of our community builders, whether they're working in the field or in an office, is going to be, essential. And we're going to have to be prepared to make sure that our neighbors that come into City Hall are also properly equipped. One thing that we're launching tomorrow is making sure that the riders on our transit system have masks that are available to them as well. So not only are our drivers wearing face coverings, but we're trying to get all of our neighbors that ride the bus to do that as well.
And so when we're talking about, phase 2, and now we've been into it quite a few times now, weeks, what do you think, you would do different, or you will tell yourself to do kind of, if we're talking about the second time around, if that comes? Do you have any kind of best practices that you could share or wanted to share with your, Lee Feldman of a few weeks ago?
I think, again, better communication is key in the beginning. Communication with our workforce, our community builders, as well as the neighbors. I think that's important. I'm not sure how we would do that differently yet, but I think we've got to strategize on that. And then the second part, and this isn't just on the city, but I think it's on the entire system, is understanding the data sets, making sure that the data sets are as close to real time as we can get, and learning how to make decisions off of data that we've never really looked at before. I think, I speak probably for most cities here in the state of Florida, we have just not been in the public health business. That has been delegated off to the state and down to the county level through the state. But I think we need to think about it differently. And I think we're going to have a lot of after action reports, practices, as to what are best practices. Do you take a vulnerable population like the homeless camp and break it up and have vulnerable individuals dispersed into the community? Or do you say it's okay right now to have a homeless camp buried in the woods and keep those individuals socially segregated from the community, because you don't want potential spread, but how do you make sure that they're being taken care of at the same time? So, I mean, there's all sorts of issues that we're going to have to go through and you know, try to figure out what best practices will be for the future. I mean, you can just look at the CDC. That all changes, you know, CDC guidance is changing every day. And so we're responding and trying to be consistent with guidance that becomes a moving target.
Yeah, and as you said, kind of getting this real-time data is not easy, especially when you're looking at data that cities never had to dealt with before. So we have just, well, we're actually past 4 minutes. So, but let's give just last chance for any questions and answers. So anyone that have a question, please feel free to post it. And Lee, if you have any kind of last lessons or best practices you want to share before we're finishing.
I mean, I just commend all of you know, my fellow local government professionals. We're on the front line. We're trying to figure this out as we go. You know, I've heard all the analogies from flying a plane while you build it to, you know, taking a shower while you're trying to tile it to on there. But I think, you know, we need to, you know, recognize that we're all in uncharted territory, and you know, this is where we use the skill set that we've developed over the years to, you know, remain calm, try to build consensus, and make sure that we're doing the, you know, the right thing, and making sure that we become the voice for the section of the community that has no voice on there, and that's you know, that's a very hard thing to do. And doing this in an environment where we want to make sure we too are protected, and making sure our families are taken care of as well.
And Lee, one last question. We always get you know, many questions at the end, but one last question is pretty heavy one. But what are kind of the thinking of the long-term financial sense? Kind of resilience of the city due to COVID-19, and are there any strategies around that, or is it also something that you're just starting to?
So I think that, you know, there's short-term and long-term. You know, from the short-term, we know that there's going to be a hit in Florida for cities on sales tax and municipal revenue sharing, and probably local option gas tax dollars. But you know, luckily for cities in Florida, a bulk of our revenue comes from property tax, and our property tax assessed values are locked in as of January 1st, 2020. And so we really won't see a hit in terms of property tax values if the values do decrease until fiscal year 22. So I think, you know, in the short term, it's making sure we can cover whatever expenditures we're making now with some loss in revenue. Long term, if our local businesses or small businesses don't come back, that's going to have a tremendously negative effect on us. So just as we experienced during the Great Recession about 13 years ago, you know, we're going to see some storefronts close and some stress on the real estate market. We're going to have to, you know, start thinking about operating a little bit like that for a few years until the economy recovers. Had a couple good days in the stock market last few days, but that seems to have gone away today. So, you know,
well,
we've got to play this one day at a time.
Another, yeah. another thing that is hard to kind of trust on a day-to-day. Lee, I really appreciate your time today, and thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge. We will share the recording with anyone registered to the webinar, and we'll make it available, and share your contact for any city manager that would like to follow up with additional questions.
Thank you, and again, thank you for everybody for participating. You know, looking at the list of individuals that put their names down, I know there's a lot of great leaders out there dealing with these same issues in their communities. So my hat's off to them.
Thank you, Lee. Have a safe rest of day and weekend, and we're looking forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you.